Humanity suffers from a profound, deeply embedded psychological illusion regarding the nature of light and darkness. We arrogantly believe that by simply igniting a fragile mechanical spark in the blackness, we have somehow conquered the night. We construct colossal, towering monoliths of heavy stone and thick iron on the very edge of the abyss. We build lighthouses on isolated, hostile rock formations, surrounded by the churning, violent expanse of the ocean. And we sit inside these stone fortresses, safely behind thick glass, falsely convinced that our engineering can successfully insulate us from the ancient, savage wrath of nature. But the ocean is the oldest, most patient, and most ruthless entity on this planet. It existed long before we crawled out of the mud, and it will remain long after our grandest cities have turned to dust. It does not respect our architecture. The ocean deeply resents our intrusion. It views our blinding beams of light not as a triumph of civilization, but as an arrogant trespass into a domain that belongs entirely to the deep. And sometimes, with terrifying, effortless precision, the ocean decides to extinguish that light. It swallows the stone, the iron, and the men who tend the flame, erasing them from the physical universe in a single, silent fraction of a second. This is not just a story of a maritime disappearance. This is the story of the most chilling, claustrophobic, and perfectly locked room mystery in the history of the sea. The year is 1900, the dawn of a new, highly industrialized century. The location is the brutal, unforgiving western coast of Scotland. Here, located 20 miles completely isolated from the mainland in the hostile waters of the Outer Hebrides, lies a tiny jagged archipelago known as the Flannan Isles, and the largest of these desolate, wind-battered rocks is named Alien Moor. Alien Moor is not an island designed for human habitation. It is a harsh vertical fortress of black volcanic rock rising aggressively from the freezing, turbulent Atlantic Ocean. For centuries, it was known to the locals as the Isle of the Dead. Ancient Celtic shepherds would occasionally visit the island to graze their sheep, but they would perform elaborate, superstitious rituals before ever stepping onto the stone. They would strip to their knees. They would never, under any circumstances, spend the night. They sensed a lingering, invisible malice woven into the very volcanic basalt of the island, believing it was haunted by the restless, violent spirits of the sea. It is a place where rogue waves violently crash against cliffs hundreds of feet high, where the deafening roar of the ocean never ceases. But the rapidly expanding shipping lanes of the British Empire demanded a beacon in the dark. The construction of a lighthouse on Alien Moor was an arrogant declaration of war against the Atlantic. For years, brilliant engineers battled massive waves that would effortlessly snap heavy steel cranes like fragile twigs. But human stubbornness prevailed. In 1899, a magnificent technological marvel was finally completed on the absolute peak of the island, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse. It was a 74-foot-tall monolith of heavy stone equipped with the most advanced, state-of-the-art optical lenses of the era. Its massive clockwork mechanisms rotated a blinding beam of light that could pierce the thickest oceanic fog for 24 miles. It was the ultimate symbol of human triumph over the untamed darkness of the Atlantic. To operate this complex, isolated machinery, the Northern Lighthouse Board assigned 3 highly experienced, incredibly resilient men. To be a lighthouse keeper at the turn of the century was to accept a monastic vow of absolute isolation. It was a life of extreme sensory deprivation, defined only by the deafening roar of crashing water and the meticulous hypnotic ticking of the brass clockwork. James Ducat was the principal keeper, a seasoned veteran of the sea with over 20 years of experience, a man known for his meticulous, unbreakable discipline. Thomas Marshall was the second assistant, a quiet, hardened professional who had safely navigated some of the worst storms the Scottish coast had ever seen. And Donald MacArthur, the occasional keeper, a legendary figure on the mainland, known as an incredibly tough, fearless, heavily built man who settled tavern disputes with his massive fists. These were not fragile, inexperienced dreamers. They were hardened veterans of the sea, men whose entire lives were forged in the freezing rain and heavy gales of the Atlantic. They understood the ocean, they respected the ocean, and they knew the rigorous mathematical routines required to survive on a desolate rock. The rules of the lighthouse were absolute. The lamps must be polished, the oil must be filled, sealed. The heavy clockwork must be wound, and above all else, the light must never under any circumstances go out. For over a year, the operation on Eilean Mor ran with flawless mechanical perfection. But on the night of December 15, 1900, the meticulous illusion of control was quietly, deeply shattered. A heavy iron-hulled transport ship named the Archer was navigating the treacherous dark waters near the Flannan Isles. As the captain peered through the heavy sea mist, searching the dark horizon for the reassuring rotating beam of Eilean Mor, he noticed a terrifying anomaly. There was absolutely nothing. The sky was an empty, pitch-black void. The lighthouse was entirely dead. In the absolute most dangerous stretch of water in Scotland, the guiding light had simply vanished. A dead lighthouse is not merely a mechanical failure. It is a profound, chilling maritime emergency. It means something catastrophic has occurred. Due to consecutive, unusually violent winter storms, the relief ship, the Hesperus, could not reach the isolated island to investigate. For 11 agonizing days, the dark tower stood completely silent, a blind, dead monolith staring out into the churning sea, guarding its grim secret. Finally, on December 26th, the sea calmed just enough for the Hesperus to carefully drop its anchors near the jagged eastern cliffs of Eilean Mor. As the relief crew rowed a small wooden boat toward the landing docks, a heavy, deeply unsettling feeling washed over them. The usual flocks of seabirds were eerily absent. The air felt unnaturally still. Standard protocol demanded that the keepers raise a flag on the ironmast to acknowledge the arriving ship. The flagstaff was completely bare, swaying silently in the freezing wind. Protocol demanded that empty provision boxes be neatly stacked on the landing stage, ready for exchange. The landing stage was entirely empty, slick with dark ocean water. There were no men waiting on the docks. There were no shouts of greeting. There was only the deafening, indifferent crashing of the ocean waves against the black rock, and a profound, terrifying dead silence. Joseph Moore, a relief keeper and a close friend to the men on the island, slowly climbed the steep 160 stone steps toward the lighthouse. With every step he took, his heart pounded violently against his ribs. He knew the rigorous discipline of these men. They would never abandon their posts. When Moore finally reached the heavy iron entrance door of the compound, he grabbed the coal brass handle and pushed. It was locked, but it was not locked from the outside. The massive iron deadbolts had been securely fastened from the inside. Whoever had locked the door was supposed to be inside the thick stone walls. Moore unlocked the door with his master key and stepped into the suffocating, cold silence of the lighthouse. What he found inside was a masterpiece of liminal horror, a scene perfectly frozen in time, utterly devoid of violence, yet overflowing with psychological dread. The heavy entrance doors to the living quarters were securely closed. The beds in the sleeping room were neatly made, completely unslept in. In the kitchen, the mechanical clocks on the wall had completely stopped, their pendulums hanging dead and motionless. The iron fireplace was entirely cold, its ashes gray and dead, indicating no fire had been lit for days. On the heavy wooden kitchen table, a meal of salted meat and potatoes had been prepared, but never eaten. Beside the table, a single heavy wooden chair lay violently overturned on the stone floor. It was a chaotic, frozen snapshot. It looked exactly as if one of the men had suddenly frantically leaped up from his meal in a state of absolute primal panic. But there were no signs of a struggle. There were no broken items. There was not a single drop of blood. The three hardened men had simply vanished, as if they had evaporated through the thick stone walls and merged with the foggy air. But the most chilling, physically impossible detail of the entire scene was hanging silently on a brass hook by the door. To survive the brutal freezing winter storms on Eilean Mor, the keepers were equipped with heavy, thick oilskin weather coats. Leaving the lighthouse without this protective gear in the middle of December was tantamount to a death sentence. When Moore checked the hooks, he found 2 sets of weather gear missing. But the third heavy oilskin coat, belonging to Donald MacArthur, was still hanging perfectly still on its brass hook. It was the middle of December. A freezing, violent, lethal winter storm had allegedly been raging outside. Why would Donald MacArthur, an experienced, battle-hardened veteran of the sea, violently overturn his chair and run out into an apocalyptic, freezing storm wearing nothing but a thin shirt? What impossible, terrifying event could compel a man to abandon his heavy survival coat and rush directly into the freezing abyss? Or worse, was the threat so incredibly sudden, so unfathomably fast, that he simply did not have the time to reach for it? Moore frantically searched every corner of the small island. He checked the cliffs, the mechanical cranes, the western landing. He found heavy iron railings, severely twisted and bent out of shape. he found a massive supply box, weighing over a ton, violently moved from its secure location. It was clear that a wave of incomprehensible, colossal power had struck the island. But the true psychological horror of Alain Moore was not found on the rocks. It was found resting silently on the desk in the keeper's office. The official Lighthouse logbook. It was supposed to be a meticulous mathematical record of weather patterns and mechanical maintenance. But the entries leading up to December 15th read like the diary of a man slowly descending into absolute madness. The handwriting shifted from meticulous professional engineering notes to the frantic, sprawling scribbles of men losing their grip on reality. The entry for December 12th, written by Thomas Marshall, was deeply unsettling. Severe winds, the likes of which I have never seen before in 20 years, he wrote. But it was his observations of the other men that chilled the relief crew to the bone. James Ducat is remarkably quiet, Marshall recorded. And then, the most incomprehensible detail of all, Donald MacArthur has been crying. Donald MacArthur, the fearless, massive, tavern-brawling veteran of the Scottish coast. A man known to be afraid of absolutely nothing on earth or sea. What unseen, ancient horror could possibly drive a man of his immense stature to sit in a stone corner and weep like a terrified child? What happens to the human mind when it is stripped of all societal anchors and left to stare endlessly into an infinite black mirror? The entry for December 13th noted that the storm was still raging, but the men had begun to pray. 3 hardened veteran sailors, locked inside a brand new impenetrable fortress of modern stone and iron, praying desperately for their lives. But the final, most terrifying contradiction of the Flannan Isles mystery lies in the official weather records of the Scottish mainland. On December 12th, 13th, and 14th, when Marshall recorded the most apocalyptic storm of his life, every other ship, lighthouse, and weather station in the region recorded perfectly calm, clear, and quiet weather. The horrific, sanity-crushing storm that the 3 men were praying against seemed to exist only directly over the tiny rock of Alain Moore. Was it a highly localized, freak barometric anomaly? Or was it a collective, terrifying descent into a shared psychosis? It was as if a deeply localized, unnatural wrath had descended purely to terrorize that specific tower. And then, there was the final entry, written on the afternoon of December 15th, just hours before the ship Archer noticed the light was out. It was written in a calm, eerily steady hand. Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all. If the storm had truly ended, if the sea was finally calm, what force, what logic, what unimaginable terror pulled 3 experienced men out from behind heavy locked iron doors and erased them from the physical world? The official government investigation concluded that the men must have rushed out to secure loose equipment on the western landing during a sudden, unexpected rogue wave. A massive wall of black water, rising hundreds of feet out of the calm sea, effortlessly sweeping the 3 men off the sheer cliffs and dragging them down into the freezing depths. It is a logical, mathematical theory that comforts the bureaucratic mind. A rogue wave is a comforting lie bureaucrats tell themselves so they can sleep at night, and to pacify the terrified men who would have to replace the missing keepers. But it completely fails to explain the door, locked securely from the inside. It fails to explain the overturned chair, the uneaten meal, and the heavy winter coat left hanging on the hook in December. And it utterly fails to explain the localized phantom storm that broke the minds of 3 hardened sailors before the ocean ever touched them. Did a monolithic rogue wave swallow them whole? Or did the profound, infinite, and deafening isolation of the Atlantic Ocean simply fracture their reality? Did the sheer arrogance of building a beacon of light in the heart of absolute darkness invite a wrath that science cannot measure? We will never know the answer. The ocean is the ultimate vault, an apex predator that does not leave crumbs. It is a liquid tomb that does not confess its sins, and it does not return the souls it has claimed. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse still stands today, fully automated, its mechanical beam sweeping endlessly, indifferently over the dark waves. It is an empty, hollow monument to the limits of human resilience. It stands as a chilling reminder that our massive stone towers and our heavy iron doors cannot protect our fragile minds from the terrible silence of the void. We proudly build our fortresses to conquer the darkness, but sometimes those very fortresses become the locked boxes in which the darkness consumes us. History is not dead. It is never dead. It merely slumbers beneath the crushing waves and the howling winds of the outer Hebrides, patiently waiting to be remembered by those brave enough to listen to the storm. We will meet again in the next era, when humanity once more forgets the terrifying, silent warnings written in cold stone and empty chairs. You are watching past Resurrected. Until the next era, silence, faint sound of distant crashing waves.